Good morning, folks. This is your quick ticker update for the 5th. Last night, I was sitting in a eating and drinking establishment before a concert, having a couple of beers and some food, and a gentleman sitting a couple of stools down from me, and I got into a conversation that started on the Hong Kong protests, and essentially the gist of it was, well, the government over there is a bunch of jackbooted thugs and this and that and the other thing. I said, well, not that simple. All governments exist only with the consent of the governed. And they said, oh, no, they could do whatever the hell they want now and this and that and the other thing. I said, oh, so that would apply here in the United States too. And there was this kind of twisted, wry grin on his face. And he says, well, and I said, 1776 didn't work out that well for the British, who thought the same way you do. And he says, well, yeah, but the government now has, machine guns. And I said, well, then they had cannons. And he's like, well, yeah. I said, oh, by the way, the citizens had cannons too. And he was like, oh, no, they did. Yes, they did. Only wealthy people, of course. I said, but that isn't the point. I said, you take a look at places like Iraq and what we've gone through over there, and Afghanistan, which is an ungovernable hellhole. Both Russia and the United States have tried to suppress it and turn it into a peaceful place, and it hasn't worked because the people don't want it. And, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden your head explodes, or you're driving down the street and all of a sudden your truck or car explodes because there's a improvised bomb that was made with $2 worth of materials on the side of the road. And he says, well, that can't happen here. Well, maybe not. All right, why am I bringing this up? Because in the context of impeachment and what's going on right now with this Ukraine investigation, everything else, let me point out that there is more corruption here than you can imagine. I believe that the whole reason that this is going on at the moment is because Donald Trump is trying to get some of this corruption out and ask that it be, put into some kind of an investigation and run down. And the problem is it's not Joe Biden. Joe Biden is small ball in this. I mean, yes, it looks like his son managed to extract $600,000 a year for doing basically nothing. But remember, Joe Biden also was a so-called Chinese equity expert, supposedly. He got $1.5 billion of Chinese money to run. He had absolutely no reason to be selected for such a position. And if you look at the Foreign Service and the State Department and everything related to it, and especially when you start digging into some of these Ukrainian things and the energy deals and things like this, you're going to find that Speaker Pelosi's son is all over some of this too. So the better question is, who isn't involved in this stuff on both sides of the aisle? Remember, in the Ukraine, folks, we interfered in and essentially caused the collapse of what was a very corrupt and autocratic government, but we interfered in it and made it happen. Why did we do it? Consider the consequences of doing it. One of the consequences is that Russia went into Crimea and essentially annexed it. Why did they do that? Because the new Ukrainian government was not going to allow them to have their 12-month deep water naval port, the only one they have. That was not ever going to happen under any set of circumstances. So why was it so? And by the way, the people in the State Department and Barack Obama and everybody else, anybody who didn't know this doesn't have two nickels to rub together for IQ. So why did they do it anyway? And you want my bet, it's because they were protecting a corruption and grift system that was running out of our government and out of our taxpayer funds and into places, including but not limited to the Ukraine. And I think the record, if you were to actually dig enough of this up to document it, that's what you're going to find. Now, I don't have the facts to back that up at this point. I'm not going to say I do, but I have an awful lot of smoke coming out of the ground from different holes. And when you start running a little bit of just public searches on data that's been out there for the last 10, 15 years, and you start running some of these things down, you go, wait a minute, there's way too many of these threads. The people that did things that should have gotten them in a whole lot of trouble, prosecuted, not just, a little company got delisted, by the way, that Nancy Pelosi's son was involved in. It was an energy-related thing. Then there's another one that her son was involved in. Then there's this, and then there's that. There is some evidence that a Russian dude was involved in it as well. People who had been convicted of securities fraud, so they were supposedly barred from life from being involved in public companies. They're involved. There's all kinds of hinky stuff going on here, folks. So what was the real reason for our intervention in the Ukraine back during Barack Obama's presidency? What was the real reason for Hillary Clinton's State Department and then John Kerry's State Department to be involved in all this nonsense? And oh, by the way, how much money went into the Clinton Foundation from Ukrainian oligarchs by country, and why was that the number one source of so-called donations? What were they getting back? If this rabbit hole gets uncovered, the people of this country may decide that their government's illegitimate anymore, and it doesn't matter whether the left or right is running it. You ought to think about the consequences of that, folks, if it happens. There's a lot of people who say we ought to just protect, your next president's all okay, whatever. Folks, that's not how it works. I know. Ford set the precedent with Nixon. He pardoned him immediately on the way out the door to essentially cauterize the gaping wound that was left there by Nixon's resignation. Nixon, if you remember, was threatened with being impeached because he altered tapes that documented that he knew about a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. He personally did not participate in it, but he knew about it, and he didn't do anything about it. And, of course, that was a political act of espionage, and that was enough for him to be threatened with impeachment and the possibility of removal from office. And then Ford pardoned him after he resigned, knowing that they were probably going to come for his scalp. All right, now if he'd burned the tapes, destroyed them instead of altering them, or if he never had them at all, my guess is he would have gotten away with it. Just like so many of other presidents have gotten away with things that are absolutely outrageous. But, there you go. So there's an overtone to this, folks, that looks a whole lot worse than it really is. And I'm going to leave you with that for right now. But contemplate what really makes government possible in the modern age in America. Because there's an awful lot of landmass, there's an awful lot of people, and there, on a comparative basis, there's this thin veneer. When I walk to a hotel at 11 o'clock at night, the reason I can do that without having eyes on both sides of my head and a gun pointed each way is because there is this thin veneer of civility where we all, for the most part, believe that we're all going to behave and be reasonable. If that goes away, how much of the economy is left? How much of the political process is left? And what are the implications of that? You ought to think about it, because there is an awful lot going on under here, folks, in terms of looting. And in fact, I think there's a fairly clean argument to be made that the only reason our government exists at this point is to figure out how to loot somebody. And I'm not talking about President Trump necessarily, because I haven't seen any evidence that he and his family are actually looting anybody yet. But I am talking about the general premise of all of the 535 butt clowns that are in Congress, along with all of the civil service positions in support of them and everything else. Right? You got to think about this real long and hard, because I don't think you have given any thought, for the most part, the people who are listening to this podcast and others, about the scope and scale of what is likely involved here. You need to, and you need to do a little research. Just look, get on Google, start looking at some of the Pelosi son stuff. That's enough for you to start. Pelosi son Ukraine. Just kind of start there and see where that goes. And again, I haven't spent a huge amount of time going down the rabbit hole yet, just a little bit. But all these little holes in the ground, they're all smoking, and when I blow some blue smoke into one, it seems to come out all the other holes. So it looks like there's a connection here that goes an awfully long way, right? And that's a problem. I'm your ticker guy, and that's my view.